They were dead wrong to think a rotting cabin in the Oregon woods was the end for me. My sister walked out of the lawyer's office holding keys to a dazzling San Diego penthouse, calling me a dirty drifter. But when I pushed open the creaky door of that shack and found a hidden safe beneath the decaying floorboards, I realized my mother was not crazy. She had handed me the perfect noose to strangle their billion-dollar empire. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Genesis Black. I am 34 years old, and my days are spent dissecting complex numerical webs as a senior financial data investigator for Vanguard Ledger Analytics. I trace missing funds, expose corporate fraud, and find the truth buried beneath layers of deception. But on this particular morning, no amount of analytical logic or professional detachment could have prepared me for the suffocating, heavy atmosphere inside the hyper-modern, glass-walled conference room of a prestigious law firm in downtown Seattle. We were gathered for the official reading of my late mother's will. The air conditioning hummed a low, sterile tune, yet the room felt completely devoid of oxygen. Across the expansive, highly polished mahogany table sat my older sister, Chloe. She was dressed in an impeccable designer suit that probably cost more than what most people earn in 12 months. Beside her sat her notoriously ambitious husband, Julian, who was tapping his expensive pen against the tabletop in restless anticipation. When the senior attorney finally cleared his throat and began to read the legally binding clauses, the absolute division of wealth became blindingly clear. The entire document leaned so heavily in Chloe's favor that the sheer imbalance of it almost felt like a calculated insult. The attorney's voice droned on, officially transferring a spectacular, sprawling $5 million penthouse in San Diego directly into Chloe's manicured hands. As if that was not enough, she was also awarded 100% of the controlling shares in our family's highly lucrative legacy media enterprise. Chloe's lips curled into a triumphant, predatory smile. She had won, and she wanted everyone in the room to know it. Then, the attorney turned the page. It was my turn. He adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses, hesitating for just a fraction of a second before reading out the final disposition of assets. For me, my mother had left a single, obscure property. It was described as a rundown, aging log cabin sitting on 50 acres of entirely uncultivated, wild terrain deep within the remote, heavily forested mountains of Oregon. There were no trust funds attached. There were no stock portfolios. Just a patch of dirt and decaying wood in the middle of absolute nowhere. A heavy, awkward silence instantly crashed over the extended family members who were lining the perimeter of the room. Aunts and uncles exchanged uncomfortable, sideways glances, but Chloe did not even attempt to mask her cruel amusement. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh that bounced off the expensive acoustic paneling of the room. "Well, isn't that just poetically fitting?" Chloe sneered, leaning forward so the overhead lighting could catch the massive diamond dripping from her earlobe. "A dirty drifter gets a useless dirt pile. Do yourself a massive favor. Genesis, take your pathetic little shack and stay entirely out of our way. You have absolutely no place in my world now. So do not even think about crawling to my doorstep begging for a handout when you inevitably go broke." The relatives held their breath, their eyes darting toward me with sickening, transparent pity. They fully expected me to snap, to burst into angry tears, or to scream about the blatant, humiliating injustice of our mother's final wishes. But in my line of work, you learn very quickly that reacting with raw emotion only hands your opponent a loaded weapon. Anger is a vulnerability I could not afford. I kept my expression entirely impassive, building a blank wall of absolute, chilling calm. I did not dignify her vile taunt with a single word of response. I simply reached across the cold, polished wood, quietly took the thin, insignificant stack of property deeds bearing my name, and stood up from my leather chair. I adjusted my coat, turned on my heel, and walked straight out of that suffocating, toxic room without sparing a single backward glance, leaving their pathetic whispers and Chloe's arrogant laughter securely behind a heavy oak door. I did not waste a single minute shedding tears over a lost inheritance I had never truly expected to receive anyway. By 3 o'clock that exact same afternoon, I had thrown 3 days' worth of clothes, my high-powered encrypted laptop, and my forensic accounting software drives into the back seat of my car. I merged onto the southbound interstate, gripping the steering wheel with quiet determination. It would be a relentless, grueling 7-hour drive down through the dense, rain-soaked pine forests and winding, treacherous mountain roads of the Pacific Northwest. I needed to see this supposed worthless pile of rotting wood with my own 2 eyes. My mother was a brilliantly sharp, endlessly calculating woman. She never made mistakes. As the miles rolled by, a quiet certainty settled into my bones. I knew in my gut that she did not leave me this isolated property by accident. The global positioning system lost its satellite signal almost 2 hours before I reached the designated coordinates. Night had completely swallowed the towering, ancient pines by the time my headlights finally swept across the boundary line of the property. I parked the car, the crunch of loose gravel beneath my tires echoing like sharp gunshots in the dead, suffocating silence of the forest. As I stepped out into the freezing mountain air, I braced myself for the crumbling, rotting shack Chloe had so eagerly mocked. Instead, the structure looming in the darkness made my pulse spike with immediate suspicion. This was no abandoned lumberjack cabin. The exterior logs were distressed to look old. Yes, but the foundation gripping the earth was poured. Solid concrete. When I cautiously approached the front door, I fully expected to find a flimsy rusted padlock. Instead, I found a heavy, reinforced steel core door, cleverly paneled in rough cedar to disguise its true strength. Running my fingers along the heavy frame, I felt the unmistakable slick glass of a high-end, concealed biometric security scanner hidden beneath a faux bronze weather plate. My mother had not just bought a house in the woods. She had built a fortified bunker. The property deed came with a thick envelope containing a physical master key and an alphanumeric passcode. I punched in the sequence, and the heavy door hissed open with the silent precision of a bank vault. I stepped inside, immediately flipping the master light switch. The interior was Spartan, but immaculately preserved. There was no thick layer of dust, no smell of decaying wood or damp earth. A sophisticated climate control system hummed faintly beneath the solid oak floorboards. I locked the door behind me, the heavy internal deadbolt sliding into place with a satisfying final thud. I moved slowly through the main living space, my investigator instincts instantly taking over. Nothing in this room was random. My mother was a brilliant woman who communicated in intricate puzzles and hidden ledgers. I ran my hands over the rough stone of the fireplace, the heavy dining table, and finally, a massive floor-to-ceiling bookshelf dominating the far western wall. The thick volumes of classic literature sitting on the shelves were entirely undisturbed. But down at the base, exactly where the heavy wood met the floorboards, there were faint, almost imperceptible semicircular scuff marks. The massive shelf was designed to pivot. I wedged my fingers firmly against the side decorative molding and pushed with all my weight. It required massive physical effort, but the entire shelving unit swung outward on perfectly oiled, heavy-duty industrial hinges. Behind it was not a wall of standard fiberglass insulation, but a dark, narrow alcove lined entirely with fireproof drywall. Resting on a reinforced steel pedestal in the center of the hidden space was a massive, commercial-grade titanium safe. A digital keypad glowed faintly red in the deep shadows. I stared at the blinking cursor. There were no notes left behind, no clever riddles written on scraps of paper, but I knew how my mother operated. She never trusted complex algorithms when a deeply personal anchor would suffice perfectly. I punched in the exact numbers of my birth date, the month, the day, and the 4 digits of the year. The machine beeped once. A loud, heavy mechanical clack echoed in the tight space, and the thick metal door swung open heavily on its hinges. Inside the cold steel vault, There was no expensive jewelry, no stacks of hidden cash. There was only a single, incredibly thick, leather-bound dossier. I pulled it out, feeling the immense physical weight of the paper in my hands, and carried it over to the dining table. I pulled my encrypted laptop from my bag, booted up my forensic accounting software, and spread the physical contents under the bright overhead light. It was a chaotic but meticulously organized web of topographical surveys, heavily redacted corporate emails, offshore shadow company registrations, and dozens of old land purchase contracts dating back over 5 years. I leaned in, my eyes scanning the complex web of real estate transactions with the clinical precision of a surgeon. This was my native language. The dummy corporations were layered 3 deep, designed specifically to hide the identity of the true buyer, but they made sloppy administrative errors. I traced the shell companies through a maze of tax havens right back to their source. When I saw the final holding company names stamped at the bottom of a master ledger, the breath completely left my lungs. It was Julian's primary commercial development group. My brother-in-law was quietly orchestrating the largest private land acquisition in the state's history. The blueprints spread before me detailed a monstrous, sprawling luxury eco-resort. It was a mega project explicitly valued at over $1 billion in projected revenue. It was designed to include private helipads, a sprawling professional golf course, and highly exclusive wellness retreats carved directly into the pristine mountainside. I found the shadow loan agreements buried in the back of the file. Julian had borrowed dangerously heavily against his other corporate assets to fund the initial surveying and land grabs. This single, massive project was the absolute foundation of Julian and Chloe's entire net worth. It was the heavily leveraged gamble that allowed them to maintain their suffocating, arrogant facade of elite wealth in San Diego. But as I layered the transparent topographic maps over one another, matching the precise property lines, the true, devastating brilliance of my mother's final play revealed itself. The majestic mountain peak Julian planned to develop was entirely landlocked by protected federal nature reserves. There was only one single, viable path of entry and exit for the heavy construction equipment, the material transport trucks, and the future wealthy clientele required to make the resort profitable. It was a narrow, winding canyon valley that functioned as the absolute choke point for the entire billion-dollar operation. Without the legal right-of-way through that specific valley, the mountain peak was entirely inaccessible and utterly worthless. And sitting directly across the throat of that one and only access route, holding the exclusive, unyielding private property rights, was the exact 50-acre plot of land I was currently standing on. The land my mother had secretly purchased through anonymous shell companies years before Julian even finalized his initial zoning permits. She had known about his ruthless, unethical land grabs. She had watched him financially destroy small property owners to clear his path. And in total secrecy, she had bought the final, most critical puzzle piece. I sat back in the wooden chair, staring at the maps as a cold, dangerous smile slowly spread across my face. Chloe thought she had inherited the kingdom, but she was completely oblivious. Our mother had not left me a useless pile of dirt in the woods. She had handed me the trigger to a fully loaded weapon pointed directly at Julian's empire. She had deliberately engineered a scenario where I possessed the ultimate power of life and death over their entire financial existence. Exactly 3 days after I had crossed the threshold of the hidden bunker, the deep silence of the forest was shattered by the aggressive, whining roar of a high-performance engine. I was sitting at the heavy dining table, reviewing the last of the shadow ledger files, when the external motion sensors pinged my secure laptop. A sleek, midnight black European sports car was tearing up the gravel driveway, kicking up a massive cloud of dust that settled over the pristine pine needles. It was a vehicle designed for the smooth asphalt of a coastal highway, not the rugged, unforgiving terrain of the Pacific Northwest. I closed my laptop, slid it out of sight, and waited. A heavy knock echoed against the reinforced cedar door. When I pulled it open, the bitter mountain wind rushed in, carrying the overwhelming scent of Chloe's sickeningly sweet designer perfume. There she stood, draped in a luxurious cashmere coat, shivering dramatically while clutching an expensive leather handbag. Julian stood right behind her, wearing a tailored charcoal suit completely unsuited for the wilderness. Their faces were stretched into painfully forced, plastic smiles. The sheer arrogance of their sudden, unannounced appearance was staggering. They really believed I was just a naive, grieving sister trapped in a shack. "Oh, Genesis, you poor thing," Chloe gasped, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Her eyes darted around the intentionally Spartan main room, taking in the rough stone and plain furniture with undisguised horror. She practically shuddered. "Look at this dreadful place. It is so utterly depressing. We just could not stop worrying about you out here all alone in the middle of nowhere." Julian closed the heavy door behind him, rubbing his manicured hands together. "It really is freezing up here," he added, his tone dripping with fake, practiced sympathy. "We know things were a little tense back in Seattle, Genesis, but at the end of the day, we are family. We cannot just let you rot away in this miserable isolation." I leaned against the heavy wooden kitchen counter. Crossing my arms, I let them perform their little theatrical production. Observing them with the detached, clinical eye of an investigator, their desperation was a thick, invisible fog filling the room. They had not driven 7 hours through treacherous mountain passes out of the goodness of their hearts. The deadline for their massive loan repayments was looming, and they needed this land. "What do you want, Julian?" I asked. My voice completely flat and devoid of any emotional warmth. Julian offered a slick, polished smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his expensive suit jacket and slowly withdrew a crisp, folded piece of paper. He stepped forward and placed it deliberately on the kitchen counter, sliding it toward me with the confidence of a man who believes he is holding a winning hand. "We want to help you start fresh," Julian said, his voice dropping into a smooth, persuasive register. "You are a smart woman, Genesis. You know this dilapidated cabin is practically a teardown. The land is completely useless for farming, and you are miles away from basic civilization. We want to buy this burden off your hands. That check right there is for exactly $100,000. It is a wildly generous offer, well above the market appraisal for this specific acreage. You can take that money, go back to the city, and put a solid down payment on a beautiful, modern condominium." I looked down at the slip of paper. $100,000. To the average person, it might sound like a massive windfall, but my mind instantly calculated the brutal mathematics of his insult. The figure printed on that check was barely a fraction of a single % of the $1 billion mega resort he was desperately trying to build on the adjacent mountain. He was attempting to secure the most critical, life-saving asset of his entire corporate existence for absolute pennies. He genuinely thought I was stupid. I did not touch the check. I did not even blink. I simply lifted my gaze and locked eyes with my brother-in-law. "No, thank you," I replied, my tone as calm and steady as a frozen lake. "I think I will keep it." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Julian's polished smile froze on his face. His confident posture stiffened, and I watched with immense satisfaction as a single bead of cold sweat broke out along his hairline. He blinked rapidly, clearly struggling to process the rejection. In his world, money solved every problem, and $100,000 was supposed to be an irresistible bait for a supposedly struggling data analyst. "Genesis, you are not being reasonable," Julian stammered, his smooth facade cracking just a fraction. "You cannot possibly want to live out here like a wild animal. Be practical." "I am being very practical," I countered smoothly. "This land was our mother's final gift to me. It holds immense sentimental value. I plan to preserve it exactly as it is, forever." The word forever hit Julian like a physical blow to the stomach. The color drained completely from his face. He knew exactly what that meant for his landlocked development. But before he could attempt another desperate negotiation tactic, Chloe finally snapped. The mask of the caring, sympathetic sister shattered into a million jagged pieces. "You spiteful, Pathetic little witch, Chloe shrieked, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She slammed her hands down on the wooden counter. You think you can just sit here in your filthy dirt pile and play games with us? You have absolutely no idea what you are dealing with. We will tie you up in legal battles for the next 20 years. We will bleed you completely dry until you are begging us to take this cursed land for free. Chloe, stop, Julian hissed, grabbing her arm tightly, his panic now visible. But she ripped her arm away, her chest heaving with fury. Mark my words. Genesis, Chloe snarled, stepping into my personal space, her eyes blazing with absolute venom. You will not keep this property. You will lose everything. I did not flinch. I simply stepped to the side and opened the heavy front door, letting the biting wind howl back into the room. The drive back to Seattle is very long. I suggest you get a head start before it gets too dark. Breathing heavily, Chloe turned on her expensive heels and stormed out the door. Julian lingered for a split second, his eyes darting frantically around the room as if searching for a hidden camera, before he scrambled out after his wife. The sports car engine roared to life, the tires spinning wildly in the dirt as they sped away down the mountain. I locked the heavy steel core door and immediately recalibrated the external perimeter sensors. Their visit confirmed everything. They were backed into a corner, and cornered animals are inherently dangerous. My suspicions were validated exactly 4 hours later. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the silent alarm system on my laptop flared a brilliant, warning red. I sat up in the darkness, pulling up the encrypted feed from the concealed infrared cameras mounted high in the surrounding pine trees. Through the glowing green night vision feed, I watched 3 heavily built men dressed in dark tactical gear creeping through the dense underbrush near the eastern property line. They were carrying heavy metal crowbars and what looked like incendiary tools. Julian had wasted 0 time. If he could not buy me out, he was clearly planning to intimidate me, perhaps burn the cabin to the ground to force me off the land. But my mother had anticipated exactly this level of corporate thuggery. I did not panic. I did not call the local sheriff, who was stationed over 40 miles away. Instead, I calmly typed a command sequence into my laptop. Instantly, the hidden, military-grade security deterrents activated. High intensity, blinding strobe lights erupted from the tree canopy, completely destroying the intruder's night vision. Simultaneously, a deafening, high-decibel sonic siren blasted through the concealed directional speakers, creating an agonizing, disorienting wall of sound specifically targeted at their location. On the camera feed, the 3 men dropped their tools in sheer panic, covering their ears and stumbling blindly backwards into the treacherous thorn bushes. They turned and sprinted back into the deep woods, completely terrified and thoroughly defeated. I closed the laptop monitor and poured myself a glass of water. The war had officially begun, and I held every single advantage. I returned to my desk at Vanguard Ledger Analytics 48 hours later, bringing the entire digitized contents of my mother's secret vault with me. My corporate office was a sanctuary of humming servers and glowing ultra-wide monitors, the perfect environment for a digital autopsy. I was a senior financial data investigator, and Julian had just made the fatal mistake of leaving a massive digital footprint, using Vanguard's proprietary, enterprise-grade tracing software. I began to systematically dismantle the financial architecture of his development company. It took me exactly 3 days and 3 sleepless nights of running predictive insolvency algorithms and scraping international banking registries to uncover the absolute, terrifying truth of his situation. Julian was not just wealthy, he was drowning in a catastrophic level of highly leveraged, toxic debt. To acquire the surrounding mountain properties, his holding company had secured over $750 million in short-term, high-yield loans from a consortium of aggressive private equity firms. The terms of those contracts were exceptionally brutal. I read through the heavily guarded covenant clauses and discovered a devastating vulnerability. The loan agreements explicitly stipulated that heavy construction on the luxury eco-resort had to officially commence within exactly 90 days of the final land acquisition. If Julian failed to break ground by that strict deadline, the lenders possessed the legal right to trigger an immediate default cascade. They would aggressively seize every single one of his collateralized assets, including his personal properties, his offshore accounts, and most importantly, the entire legacy media corporation Chloe had just inherited. If he did not get his heavy machinery through my 50-acre valley, his billion-dollar empire would instantly evaporate into a humiliating public bankruptcy. He was practically a dead man walking, and he knew it. But cornered predators always strike back. Exactly 1 week after the disastrous confrontation at the cabin, a sharply dressed process server intercepted me in the lobby of my office building, aggressively shoving a thick manila envelope into my chest. I did not need to read past the first page of the legal summons to understand their desperate strategy. Unable to buy the land and unable to physically intimidate me, Chloe and Julian had officially petitioned the state Supreme Court to entirely invalidate our mother's will. Their core argument was sickeningly malicious. They submitted a motion claiming that our mother was suffering from severe, undiagnosed dementia and complete cognitive collapse during the final 12 months of her life. They argued that her mind was totally broken when she drafted the codicil leaving the property to me, implying I had manipulated a severely sick, delusional woman. If the judge ruled in their favor, the property deed would be nullified, reverting back into the general estate, which Chloe now legally controlled. They thought they could use their massive wealth to steamroll me in a courtroom. They were spectacularly wrong. I did not waste a single minute searching for a cheap, sympathetic family lawyer. I liquidated my entire retirement portfolio, cashed out every stock I owned, and hired Marcus Thorne. Marcus was a notoriously ruthless, high-stakes corporate litigator who charged $2,000 an hour and possessed a fearsome reputation for utterly destroying opposing legal teams. When I sat down in his sprawling, high-rise office and slid the drive across his heavy oak desk, I did not ask for a defense strategy. I asked for absolute annihilation. While Marcus began preparing the aggressive procedural filings to counter their ridiculous claims, I dove back into the deepest, heavily encrypted partitions of my mother's digital archives. I knew she would not have left me to fight a legal war without a trump card. I ran a brute force decryption protocol on a hidden folder disguised as a system file, and what I found inside was pure gold. It was an extensive, perfectly archived chain of personal emails sent directly from Julian's private server to my mother exactly 2 years prior. The messages were blunt, ruthless, and highly incriminating. Julian had viciously threatened to leak fabricated, highly damaging tax evasion scandals to the federal authorities to destroy our family's media company if she did not secretly sell him the Valley Corridor. It was not just aggressive corporate negotiation, it was documented. Irrefutable felony extortion. My mother had saved every single terrifying threat, neatly packaging the exact undeniable proof that would eventually guarantee his complete downfall. Armed with this devastating evidence, I implemented a strategy of absolute, unbreakable radio silence. Marcus issued a strict gag order. I did not respond to the court summons publicly. I ignored the dozens of frantic, taunting text messages Chloe sent to my personal phone. "You are completely out of your depth, Genesis." One message read, "Surrender the deed now, or I will make sure you are paying our legal fees for the rest of your miserable life." I left every single message unread. I blocked Julian's unknown numbers. I completely vanished from all social media platforms and refused to engage with any of our mutual relatives who reached out fishing for gossip. This total vacuum of information worked exactly as I had calculated. In the absence of a response, Chloe and Julian's massive egos naturally assumed the absolute best-case scenario for themselves. They mistook my strategic silence for paralyzing fear. They convinced themselves that I was hiding in my apartment, thoroughly terrified by their expensive, aggressive legal team, completely incapable of mounting a real defense. They swaggered through the pre-trial motions, fully believing I was right on the verge of total surrender. Behind the closed doors of Marcus Thorne's office, however, I was meticulously assembling a flawless, impenetrable arsenal. I indexed the forensic accounting reports detailing Julian's imminent insolvency. I verified the digital signatures on the extortion emails. I secured a signed, ironclad psychological evaluation from the state's most respected chief of neurology, definitively proving my mother possessed a perfectly sharp, flawless mental capacity until the very second her heart stopped beating. Every document, every timestamp, every financial ledger was systematically organized into a lethal legal trap. I was not just preparing to defend my inheritance. I was quietly waiting for the doors of the courtroom to open so I could lock them inside and burn their entire fraudulent world to the ground. The heavy mahogany double doors of the county Supreme Courthouse swung open exactly at 9 o'clock in the morning. The grand, high-ceilinged courtroom was already packed with spectators, legal aides, and a surprisingly large contingent of local business reporters. Chloe and Julian had aggressively courted the press for weeks, attempting to spin a public narrative of a deeply concerned family trying to rescue an estate from a predatory, estranged sister. They walked down the center aisle looking like absolute royalty. Chloe wore a pristine, brilliantly tailored white designer dress, her chin held high with practiced, aristocratic grief. Julian walked firmly beside her in a custom navy blue suit, projecting the image of a steady, wealthy patriarch. They took their seats at the plaintiff's table, completely radiating smug, untouchable confidence. I sat alone at the defense table with Marcus Thorne. I wore a simple, sharply cut black suit. My posture was completely rigid, my expression utterly unreadable. I did not look at my sister. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on the imposing wooden bench at the front of the room, waiting for the presiding judge to take his seat. The moment the preliminary hearing was officially called to order, Julian's lead attorney launched his offensive. He was a loud, theatrical man who paced aggressively in front of the judge, using sweeping hand gestures and a booming voice designed to intimidate. "Your Honor, we are here today to correct a tragic, deeply manipulative injustice," the attorney bellowed, pointing a dramatic finger in my direction. "We have undeniable, documented proof that during the final 12 months of her life, the deceased was suffering from profound, rapid-onset cognitive decline. She was deeply confused, highly paranoid, and completely incapable of understanding the massive financial implications of her actions. We submit to the court these sworn medical observations from her private, in-home care staff, detailing how she would frequently forget her own name and wander the halls in a state of sheer delirium. We argue that Genesis Black deliberately preyed upon this tragic mental weakness to coerce an entirely invalid codicil. Stealing a critical piece of family real estate, he slammed a thick, official-looking binder down onto the judge's desk with a heavy thud. A low murmur rippled through the packed press gallery. Chloe brought a delicate lace handkerchief to her eyes, dabbing at fake, completely non-existent tears. Julian placed a comforting, highly visible hand on her shoulder. They were performing their victim routine flawlessly, completely convinced that their expensive, fabricated evidence was the final nail in my coffin. The judge adjusted his glasses, flipping through the binder with a serious, concerning frown. He looked over at our table. "Does the defense have a response to these incredibly serious allegations of elder abuse and coercion?" Marcus Thorne did not jump out of his seat. He did not raise his voice. He stood up with agonizing, deliberate slowness, buttoned his suit jacket, and approached the center of the room holding nothing but a single, incredibly thin blue folder. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice dropping into a smooth, lethally calm baritone that commanded absolute silence in the massive room. "What opposing counsel has just presented to this court is, at best, gross administrative negligence. At worst, it is deliberate, criminal fraud. The in-home staff they are citing were directly hired and paid exclusively by Julian's private holding company. They are not independent medical professionals. They are paid employees regurgitating a script." Marcus opened his thin folder and handed a pristine, watermarked document directly to the judge. "I present to the court a comprehensive, heavily certified neurocognitive evaluation conducted by the chief of neurology at the state's most prestigious medical research hospital," Marcus stated clearly. turning slightly so his voice carried to the frantic press gallery. This extensive examination was conducted precisely 72 hours before the deceased tragically passed away. The results are unequivocal. The medical board found her to possess flawless spatial awareness, perfect memory retention, and a terrifyingly sharp analytical capacity. She was 100% lucid until the very second her heart stopped. She knew exactly what she was doing when she drafted that will. The smug, confident smile instantly vanished from Julian's face. He sat bolt upright in his leather chair, staring at Marcus with wide, panicked eyes. Chloe dropped her lace handkerchief, her jaw going rigid. The judge scanned the certified hospital documents, his frown deepening into a scowl of pure judicial anger directed entirely at the plaintiff's table. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Marcus continued, pacing slowly toward Julian and Chloe, "my client wishes to demonstrate exactly why this completely fraudulent petition was filed in the first place. It has absolutely nothing to do with a grieving family, and everything to do with imminent, catastrophic corporate bankruptcy." On Marcus's cue, I stood up and tapped a single button on my laptop. The massive digital projector screen mounted on the courtroom wall instantly flared to life. I did not use complex jargon. I presented the brutal, undeniable truth in massive, glowing numbers for everyone in the room to see. The screen displayed the highly confidential, aggressively leveraged corporate debt structure of Julian's development firm. I highlighted the $750 million in high-yield private equity loans. Then, I projected the strictly enforced 90-day default clause. Finally, I overlaid the topographical map of the mountain, circling the 50-acre valley I now legally owned. The plaintiffs are absolutely desperate. Your Honor, I spoke for the first time, my voice echoing coldly off the marble walls. If they do not secure the legal right-of-way through my privately owned valley, their billion-dollar eco-resort cannot be built. If they do not break ground in exactly 3 weeks, their lenders will trigger a total asset seizure. They are not trying to protect my mother's legacy. They are trying to steal my land to save themselves from total financial annihilation. The courtroom erupted into total chaos. The business reporters began typing furiously on their laptops, realizing they were witnessing the real-time destruction of one of the city's most prominent billionaires. Julian's attorney was stammering violently, desperately objecting and waving his hands. But the judge slammed his wooden gavel down with explosive force, demanding order. "I am not finished, Your Honor," I declared, my voice cutting through the noise like a serrated blade. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted digital drive. This was the ultimate weapon, the final secret my mother had buried inside the titanium safe alongside the financial ledgers. I plugged it into the courtroom audio system. "My mother knew her son-in-law was a ruthless corporate predator," I explained, looking directly at Chloe, whose face had turned the color of wet ash. "She knew he would stop at nothing to acquire that valley, which is exactly why she recorded their final private conversation." I hit play. The courtroom speakers crackled lightly, and then my mother's clear, steady voice filled the room. "I am not selling you the land. Julian, you are destroying families to build a playground for the rich. I will not be a part of it." Then came Julian's voice. It was not the polished, smooth tone he used in public. It was a vicious, unhinged, terrifying snarl. "You listen to me, you stubborn old hag." Julian's recorded voice spat, the venom dripping from every word. "You will sign those property deeds over to my company right now, or I swear to God, I will completely destroy your precious media company. I have fabricated enough tax evasion documents to trigger a massive federal raid. I will ensure your legacy is burned to the ground and your beloved daughters are dragged through the mud. Sign the paper, or I will ruin you." The silence that slammed into the courtroom was absolute and suffocating. You could have heard a single pin drop on the carpeted floor. Chloe was trembling so violently that her chair rattled against the wooden railing. She dug her manicured nails deep into Julian's arm, staring at him in sheer, unadulterated horror. The flawless mask of high society elegance was completely ripped away, leaving only a terrified, humiliated woman entirely exposed to the world. The judge looked completely disgusted, his face flushed with righteous fury as he glared down at the plaintiff's table. Julian was hyperventilating. His expensive suit suddenly looked 3 sizes too big for him. He grabbed his attorney by the collar of his shirt, frantically whispering into the man's ear. The attorney practically leaped out of his chair, his hands shaking as he addressed the furious judge. "Your Honor, the plaintiffs, we formally request to withdraw this petition entirely. Immediately, we retract all claims and request an immediate dismissal of these proceedings." They wanted to run. They wanted to drop the civil case instantly to desperately avoid the horrific, inevitable criminal prosecution for felony extortion and perjury that was now staring them right in the face. I slowly closed my laptop, neatly stacking my files. I looked across the aisle at the 2 people who had mocked me, insulted me, and tried to destroy my life. I let a cold, sharp, utterly victorious smile spread across my face. "You can withdraw the petition," I said quietly, though my voice carried perfectly through the dead, silent room. "But you cannot withdraw the truth. The civil hearing is over, Julian, but the real war has only just begun." The courtroom revelation was merely the first strike of the hammer. I did not wait for the slow, grinding machinery of the legal system to process Julian's recorded crimes. The very next morning, from the impenetrable security of my woodland sanctuary, I assembled the final pieces of the puzzle. I compiled the decrypted financial ledgers, the blatantly fraudulent loan applications, and a crystal-clear copy of the extortion audio into a massive, heavily encrypted digital dossier. I bypassed the hungry media completely and sent the files directly into the private email inboxes of the senior managing partners at the 3 massive private equity firms funding his resort. Capital is notoriously cowardly, and wealthy investors do not tolerate criminal liabilities. Within 24 hours of opening my message, those firms triggered their emergency withdrawal clauses in absolute panic. They aggressively pulled over $600 million in financial backing out of Julian's development fund overnight. The financial hemorrhage was spectacular and fatal. Without the lifeblood of that massive capital, Julian's holding company completely flatlined. He was forced to publicly file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection before the end of the week. But the nightmare for him was only just beginning. The federal authorities were already circling like vultures drawn to fresh blood. Agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission executed a brutal, highly publicized raid on his downtown corporate headquarters, violently seizing every hard drive, server, and filing cabinet in the building. Julian was placed under a massive, multi-agency federal investigation for severe credit fraud, corporate perjury, and felony extortion. The state confiscated his passport, froze every single one of his offshore accounts, and he was currently facing decades in a federal penitentiary. As for Chloe, her magnificent, glittering kingdom built on sand collapsed with terrifying speed. The $5 million San Diego penthouse she had so arrogantly flaunted came with crushing monthly property taxes and entirely exorbitant maintenance fees. With Julian's assets completely locked down by the federal government and the family media company's stock plummeting to worthless levels due to the public scandal, Chloe lost every single cent of her luxurious income. Exactly 60 days after that toxic will reading, the bank officially foreclosed on the penthouse. I watched the local news report, detailing how she was escorted out of the grand marble lobby by private security, clutching a single, pathetic designer suitcase. With her reputation utterly destroyed and her elite friends completely abandoning her, she was forced to relocate to a damp, run-down, one-bedroom apartment in an impoverished, industrial neighborhood. She was completely stripped of her wealth, her status, and her pride, banished to a world completely devoid of the high society she desperately worshipped. On the exact same afternoon, Chloe was being evicted from her towering palace. I was sitting across a heavy oak table from the regional director of the Pacific Northwest Wildlife Conservation Trust. I had spent weeks drafting a completely ironclad legal transfer with Marcus Thorne. I picked up a heavy fountain pen and signed my name at the bottom of the deed, permanently donating all 50 acres of my mother's valley to the trust. The legal stipulations I demanded were absolute and unbreakable. The land was officially designated as a protected environmental sanctuary. It could never be sold. It could never be commercially developed. And absolutely no heavy machinery would ever be legally allowed to cross its borders. With that single stroke of a pen, I completely vaporized any lingering, desperate hope Julian or his creditors might have had of ever resurrecting the billion-dollar eco-resort. Even if someone else bought the mountain peak, it was now permanently and legally cut off from the rest of the world. It was a flawless, devastating victory. But more importantly, it was the exact vision my mother had intended all along. She never bought this land for financial profit. She bought it to shield the ancient, silent beauty of the forest from the greedy, destructive hands of men like her son-in-law. She gave me the perfect weapon to strike them down, but she also gave me the impenetrable shield to protect what truly mattered. I stood alone on the reinforced wooden balcony of the cabin, feeling the crisp, sharp evening breeze against my face. The sun was dipping below the jagged mountain peaks, bleeding a brilliant, fiery red across the vast, endless sky. The ancient pine trees swayed gently, completely untouched and deeply peaceful. I took a deep breath of the incredibly pure air, savoring the profound, quiet freedom washing over me. They had called me a dirty drifter and handed me what they thought was a useless pile of rotting wood. But as I looked out over the wild, untamed empire I had just saved, I knew with absolute certainty that I had delivered the most perfect, inescapable sentence. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Maya Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.